Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
Today, we are heading to the archives for a conversation I'm still obsessed with, and that is as relevant as ever. Jesus Salas is one of the OG labor leaders and giants in Milwaukee's history. He led Wisconsin's movement for migrant workers' rights for decades and co-founded Obreros Unidos, which led a historic march in 1966, demanding lawmakers address violations of the state's minimum wage laws and housing codes. Salas himself was a migrant worker, starting work alongside his family when he was just 7 years old. After coming to Milwaukee and rising up the ranks, he joined forces with other local leaders and legends like Father James Groppe and Vel Phillips, all fighting for civil rights. In 2023, he wrote a book called Obreros Unidos, looking into the roots and legacy of the farm workers movement. And that is when he spoke with my colleague, Audrey Nowakowski. An important note before we get into all of this, there are mentions of Cesar Chavez here. And in case you missed it, earlier this year, the Times published an investigation with extensive evidence that Chavez groomed and abused girls in the farm workers movement. This conversation with Salas was recorded before any of that came out. So, here's our conversation with Jesus Salas in 2023.
So your book, Obreros Unidos, is all about the roots, the legacy of the farm workers movement. It's mainly through the 60s and 70s, and there's so much packed within there. But I want to kind of take like a perspective of what you've learned being in this movement all these years, writing this book. So the conversation about migrant workers and their rights and people's backlash to them, it's not a new thing. It's centuries old. So I'd love to learn about what key lessons you've taken away from your work, and to start with the migrant workers movement stemming from seeing the workforce as a family base. So can you share the impact of organizing families and how that's contributed to the success of the efforts?
Well, it was a family base. By the way, it isn't anymore. But at the time when I was a third-generation migrant worker. My mom and dad came here in the 40s to Hartford, Wisconsin, and the war intervened, and that it was very difficult to come up here during those years. Gas was rationed, parts were for the war effort, etc. So, but we joined him in the 50s, so we spent the next 10 years migrating seasonally from Texas. We'd stop in Illinois, and then Wisconsin, and then for the tomato harvest, then the early cotton harvest in the Delta, and then the late cotton harvest in the Panhandle of Texas, etc. But the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book, because of where I was situated in the workforce, we used to work in crews. Like in the cotton fields, we were all segregated with the Afro-Americans. And even here in Wisconsin, there would be different crews from different parts of Texas. So on the outside were the males, our fathers, the older males. And then the unmarried women were towards the end of the crew. And then the younger those of us, and we started out very young, as you noted in the book. I was 7 years old when we started migrating. We were towards the center with our aunt, my mother, and my aunt. So the picture that I write is of women working, women and children working. That was my point of view from the very beginning. And the other thing that I think that is mindful of it being a family workforce was we would have never had a youth movement. We would have never had a women's movement grow out of the farm workers movement if it hadn't been family-based. So, I tell my brothers and sisters in the labor movement now, you have to engage the whole family. You can't leave the, mom at home. This is primarily a male-dominated labor union, labor unions. The other thing that I think is important in relationship to the family was the what we call social unionism. In other words, we wanted to provide services. We won elections for a union contract in 67 after organizing 65 and 66. But Libby's wouldn't, the company, the multinational that we organized, wouldn't negotiate with us. They moved all their operations out of state. So then we went into the processing plants, into Libby's canning company. So we went from the fields to the canning operations. And of course, I had been working with Chavez, Cesar Chavez, during this period of time. And he said, look, you've been at it almost 5 years. If you help me with the great boycott, I'll help you with the. We've been in Wisconsin once. We've been in California. I'll come and help you in Wisconsin. Who was to know it was going to take us 5 years to win the first contract in the Great Boycott? But here I come to Milwaukee in 1968. And of course, you know what was going on in Milwaukee in '68, the open housing marches, etc. Father Grappi and the Youth Council. But we kept on organizing families the same way that we organize in the field. So the whole nexus of organizing youth, organizing women, I think we had both, not only in the fields in central Wisconsin, but when we came here to Milwaukee also, because we never changed our way of organizing.
Right. And on the note of Father Grappi, there was a movement between you and the other leaders like Grappi, Chavez, also Val Phillips, to name one, where you combined forces of the farm workers and the civil rights movements here in Milwaukee.
And that's very, very little noted. I was very happy to address those issues. And I call it the intersection between the civil rights movement and the farm workers movement. And I don't know if it happened by accident, but when I came to Milwaukee, Father John Maurice at the Archdiocese-funded offices at 524 West National gave me a back room to work the Great Boycott out of there. And lo and behold, that same summer of '68, Father Grappi is marching from the north side to Ellen Bradley, just several blocks down the street. So I just walked over and introduced myself, and that was the beginning.
That's how it started.
That's how it started. And he joined with us at the Great Boycott in Capitol Drive against Kohl's Food Stores when we started expanding the activities into accessing the University of Wisconsin here in Milwaukee. He joined us there. And, of course, we joined together with the welfare marches. So I joined with not only Father Grappi, but I met Val Phillips and Orville Pitts. Lloyd Barbie was a master of ceremony at one of our steel workers' hall at that time. And then when he started the lawsuit of the to desegregate the Milwaukee public school system, we piggybacked and we demanded the bilingual education and the hiring of bilingual staff, etc. So yes, those things intersected the farm workers movement and the civil rights movement. It's a great pleasure to work with Father Grappi, to get to know Val Phillips and work with Lloyd Barbie in the desegregation lawsuit. Yeah,
absolutely. What kind of lessons about strategizing and leadership did you learn from them when you were working with them?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about lessons learned. And you always, if you keep your eyes open, you're always learning. This is the first time I ever lived in a city, first of all, okay? Being a migrant worker, we've just lived in not only in rural areas, but in very small communities. So I was very apprehensive about living in Milwaukee. Of course, I can't. I never survived the experience. I fell in love with it when I came here. But I recall Father Grappi, stopping over and watching us organize at the Kohl's Food Store on Capitol Drive. And he was telling me, he says, you do a great job. You come over, you got all your leaflets printed. When the people come over, you give them the leaflet, don't buy grapes and that, write letters to the growers so they will negotiate with the farm workers in California and that. But, you got to apply a little bit of direct action. He says, well, what is that, Father Grappi? And he says, well, you've been, how many weeks are you going on now? More than a month that you've been here picketing, and there's still, they won't take the grapes off, I says, yeah, we get real angry about that. Well, why don't you go over when the customers are coming in, why don't you go over there and stop them at the parking lot, talk to them, tell them to go chop someplace else. And that's what we started to do. We started adapting, and of course, and then we went even further when we committing civil disobedience as such, peaceful, nonviolent, etc.
Good trouble.
Good trouble, yes, as a congressman would say. But yes, we learned quite a bit.
We mentioned Cesar Chavez before. He said something along the lines of there are no natural-born leaders. Would you agree? Do you consider yourself a leader?
No, no. Well, there are people that have certain skills. I think people associate oratorical skills with, having the ability to be able to consider, but not necessarily as such right out of college. My sophomore year, and for the next 3 years, I worked organizing children, trying to get their parents to, send them to las escuelitas, the little schools. And the schools grew from one demonstration project that's 1962 to 7 centers all over central Wisconsin. So here I'm going back to Texas to recruit because there was no bilingual faculty, and we needed at least one bilingual faculty in each of those 7 centers. So I had no authority to hire anybody. But the long and short of it is the United Migrant Opportunity Services, which is still going on right now, 50 years later, get funded to provide child care, but in southeastern Wisconsin. So not only had I been a farm worker, and all the people when I was organizing, people knew my background. And then when I went back into the camps to organize the daycare centers, it was to convince the farm workers that this is what we should do to improve our working and living conditions. That was a task. It wasn't that I had no abilities or that, but it was just how do we do this? And of course, I was new to it. The very first strike was a disaster, and I take full responsibility because we got caught. We found a lot of knowledge about how you conduct a strike, get assigned the cards. And, farm workers, like everybody else, they don't like to sign things if they don't know what they're getting into, so things like that. And many of them had never even voted before. So the following year when we ordered an election, that was the first time many of them had ever voted, because the franchise, of course, doesn't come until the mid-'60s. So, yeah, there was a lot of lessons learned myself. So Cesar is right. There's no natural-born leaders. You have to be trained. And to convince the police and the authorities, law enforcement, that we were a peaceful, demonstration. And we, most of the time we did, but it took some time. I had never been to jail in all the years, 4 or 5 years that I was in the labor camps. When I got to Milwaukee, I couldn't stay out of jail, but just every time we went out in the streets, the sergeant would come in, that one, that kind of thing.
So, So learning how to organize, and then in turn learning how to lead.
And learning how to lead, and learning how to live in a completely different environment, an urban environment where, we never had any difficulties, any challenges, that kind of challenges in the fields. We were out by ourselves most of the time, and unless, it wasn't until we got here that we had to adjust those issues, and they had to adjust for us too, so make adjustments for us too. So.
Well, lots of adjustments, lots of decades of action, lots of reaction and change.
Right.
And your book is not just about what you've helped move forward in the past. It's also about what's left to do and accomplish that's in front of us. So what are some key things you think need to change for Milwaukee's Latinx community to continue to thrive?
Well, for instance, if I was to be critical of some of the things that we still need to do, I think the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee could do a better job providing more extensive hiring of the faculty. I know this is a bad time of the fiscal year to be talking about that because of the present legislature has not been very kind to funding the university, even though we've at the University of Madison, we've kept tuition frozen for some time, and then the children, qualified applicants of undocumented, have to pay out of state tuition. When I was a member of the Board of Regents, we convinced the chancellors to provide some assistance to them, and then I worked with Governor Doyle to pass an in-state tuition for what we call the Dreamers. And then Governor Walker, when he came in 2010, not only takes away our right to organize as public employees, but takes away the right of the Dreamers to pay in-state tuition. So there's a big gap that needs to be remedied. And Voces de la Frontera, I'm still active with them to see if we can remedy that. The driver's license, that was just punitive. There was no reason. If you believe in safe roads, there shouldn't be anybody out there driving without learning how to drive. And the fact that you have a whole community because they simply haven't processed their documentation. Two political parties haven't been able to come together and resolve some of the issues. Look at the idea of inclusion and diversity in our colleges. Diversity and inclusion is not solely about a minority issue. I recall young women coming from rural schools who couldn't get into engineering's program, that they had to be supported with STEM programs, in other words, to enhance their mathematical skills to be able to get into their engineering programs. And I'm talking about 50 years ago And now what do we have? We have almost as many, if not more, law students and medical applicants, female, as we do male. But it was because of those efforts that were made to enhance their mathematical abilities and other coursework that they needed to get in some of these courses that the poorly funded rural schools that they came from that otherwise were outstanding students, their mathematical abilities and other skills had to be enhanced, just like some of us that came from poor inner city schools that we needed to be have our English and our math also enhanced, and that's what diversity is. It is about all. So those are the things I think that are still out there that weren't there when we were organizing that still need to be addressed. And it takes all of us, takes a whole community to respond to that and to delve into these issues and find out what's going on and to be critical about the issues that are on the table as such.
Jesus Salas is a Milwaukee labor leader and author of Obreros Unidos, The Roots and Legacy of the Farm Workers Movement. He spoke with WUWM's Audrey Nowakowski in 2023. I'm Jimmy Gutierrez. Status Pending is produced by WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, part of the NPR network. Music in this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions, and keep listening to Status Pending for more stories about immigration in Wisconsin.